Students often struggle in history courses with sources, how to read. The best way to learn how to read is to read. I mean, to get in the habit of reading. Books have a structure, an organization. There's a kind of culture of a book that isn't there in speaking. We say we should write as we speak, but we should write as we speak only if we speak perfectly and coherently all the time. Books are for most of the time are coherent. Get in the habit of reading. Students often skip the introduction and the preface. Read them. Don't skip them. Because there, in the introduction and the preface, one or the other or both, in the foreword, whatever it might be called, an author will give you a summary of the book. An author will tell you why he or she wrote the book, what the book is about, what they hope that you will learn from this book, what they hope to prove to you by reading this book, and why they wrote it. So read the introduction, read the preface, read them carefully. They might even summarize the argument that they're going to make. In this book, I will claim that X is the cause of Y and Z. And the evidence that I will use to prove that X is the cause of Y and Z follows. It's a summary of the book. The rest of the book then makes sense to you. You know when you're reading it what to look for. Even if you don't read every word of the book, you'll know what you're looking for, and you can hone in on those areas. It might be good to talk about what is a secondary source and what is a primary source. A secondary source would be a history book about the Civil War, or about the Second World War, or about the Great Depression. Something written by a historian, sometimes many years after the events described in the book and analyzed and explained in the book have taken place. So that would be a secondary source. It's secondary because it wasn't written at the time. And there is an implicit definition of a primary source. A primary source would be a book about the Civil War, or an essay about the Civil War, or a letter that a soldier wrote home to his family during the events, during the Civil War, during the Second World War. A primary source could be a diary that someone kept about their daily life in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Letters that people wrote to each other during that period. Those are primary sources. Students should approach those a little bit differently than you approach reading secondary sources, history books, where the author has a particular purpose in writing and wants to tell you what that purpose is. Primary sources often aren't quite so accessible. They're not always quite so clear, because if for nothing else, people are writing for different purposes. They're not writing for publication. They're not writing for posterity. They're writing to express what they're experiencing at the moment, or writing to tell distant loved ones what their experiences have been like. So they're not thinking that they have to explain everything. For one thing, the people they're writing to probably know what they're talking about. You may not. That's one problem. You have to find out when someone makes a reference to an event that has taken place, what it is they're talking about. That will require going to another source. There you're just looking up information. If somebody refers to the Battle of Chickamauga or the Battle of Antietam, or in the Second World War, the Battle of Anzio, and you don't know what they're talking about, that's when to stop and look it up. Now you don't even have to leave your desk to do that. You can do that by clicking on the internet. Reading a primary source presents a problem of language. Words change, the meaning of words change over time, and people might mean different things. They might use words familiar to you that don't mean the same thing to them that they mean to you. Always be careful when you read that you understand the way in which an author, whether the author of a secondary or a primary source, is using words. And if you don't know what the words mean, if you're not sure, if the word is familiar but doesn't quite make sense in the context of the source that you're looking at, look it up. I know it takes a lot of work. It takes more work at the beginning to get in the habit of doing that than it does at the end. Once you start doing that, your vocabulary will grow, and you will be better able to recognize the nuances of words, the multiple meanings that words can have down the road if you get into the habit of looking them up at first when you don't know them. With primary sources, it's always good to try to find out something about the person who wrote the source. And if you can, something about the intended audience. Learn as much as you can about the person and their circumstances. Learn as much as you can about their perspective. A soldier writing home to his family from a southern unit is likely to have a very different interpretation of the Civil War than a soldier from the north. A soldier from Alabama will interpret the war differently than a soldier from Massachusetts. They're on opposite sides. You need to know that. They have a common experience of being soldiers. If you're looking for their common experiences, you can probably overlook their different interpretations. But if you're trying to understand the mentality of North and South during the Civil War, you need to pay special attention to those differences, and also to understand what we would say are the biases of the source. The soldier from Alabama is going to have his point of view. There's going to be value in that point of view. You can't automatically dismiss it just because he's from the South and you disagree with the Southern cause. The same is true of a Northern soldier. You may agree with the Northern side in the war, but that doesn't mean that everything the Northern soldier says is going to be accurate and right. You need to develop a critical perspective. Finally, take account of tone. And that's a harder thing to develop. It's like developing a pitch for music, listening to music. If you're not familiar with music, the first time you listen to music, it's sometimes hard to figure out what happens. It all sounds confused. I remember once reading a paper in which an author claimed, and had a quote from a primary source to prove it, that no one was sympathetic, no one in a particular place in a particular time was sympathetic to the American Indians. Except the quote that he used talked about how the Indians were suffering and how terrible this was. It proved, did the quotation, that the Indians suffered, that their lives were made miserable. But it also undercut his claim that no one was sympathetic to the Indians, because the author of the passage that he quoted thought that this was terrible, that these people should be treated in this way. Many were unsympathetic to the Indians, but here at least was one person who noted their suffering and thought it was terrible. So be careful about tone. Try to pick up on not so much what people say, but how they say it. And that's true of authors of primary sources as well as authors of secondary sources.
The big thing, don't read it all at one time. I like to get my work done, so I tried that the first few times, like sit down and read all of the readings I had been assigned, and you go brain dead halfway through. So the big thing is make time to study, have priorities and a regular schedule so that you know, okay, tonight I'm going to sit down and read for about 20 minutes. Or tonight I'm going to read all of the readings that relate to this person in the French Revolution. So that way you start connecting a theme and you can pick out, okay, this is why he's important. Instead of reading, okay, I'm going to read everything he gave me about the last 2 decades. pick a theme that you're going to read about that night. I'm going to read about the French Revolution. Tonight I'm going to read about this particular guy who fought in this war. Pick one thing out so you're getting familiar with that piece of information and not throwing it all on yourself at one time.
One thing that was overwhelming for me in the beginning was primary sources versus secondary sources. I had no idea what my professor was talking about the first day when she started talking about primary versus secondary. I had no idea what they were. And primary sources are definitely, I think the tougher of the two, because secondary sources, you're just reading a book about the Declaration of Independence, for example, instead of reading the actual Declaration of Independence. The best thing I think you can do is just try to break it down in a way that's accessible to you, maybe take it chapter by chapter. If that's too much, take it, every few pages by every few pages, just slow it down as much as you need to and really try to look at, each word, each sentence, what the author is trying to say about the subject if you're finding, the text as a whole inaccessible. That's because, I've had some books that I've had to read in the past that I haven't particularly enjoyed just because they've been so dense and the language has been a little bit, too advanced or too antiquated with the older books. So for me, it's just, you have to be able to take the time and try not to get too frustrated with it and just break it down as much as you need to. Because if you try to look at something like that, a 300-page book like that, you psych yourself out. You can't take all of it at once.
Reading is complicated. It takes practice. It takes time to get good at it.